Hello, and welcome to the first lecture in the module Nietzsche, Genealogy and Morality. So now I'm going to just say a few words about Nietzsche's life, then we'll have a little break and I'll talk about some general themes of his philosophy, and then I'll talk a bit about the particular themes we're going to look at in this module. So Nietzsche's life, well, he was born in 1844 and he died in 1900. His father was a pastor, a clergyman, and he died when Nietzsche was 5. Now, you may wonder why I mention this, but as we'll see, autobiographical detail is quite important. In Nietzsche's philosophy, you end up with a position where you can't really understand a philosopher without knowing something about that philosopher's life, and my feeling is that this little fact about Nietzsche's life was quite important, both that his father was a clergyman and that his father died when Nietzsche was quite young. So from 1869 to 1878, Nietzsche was a professor of philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Why is this important? Well, he was appointed at the age of 24, which is very young to be appointed as a professor. He was a professor of philology, and this is quite important. So what's philology? Philology is the study of languages, and he was a professor of classical philology, so that's ancient Greek and Latin. And it's about small facts. It's about noticing lots and lots of small facts about ancient languages. Now, I mention this because Nietzsche is somehow sometimes associated with postmodernism, and some people think that postmodernists don't really believe in truth. Now, whether or not Nietzsche was a postmodernist is another question, but his early training was all about small facts. His early training was all about getting small facts of history right. So in 1868, he met the composer Wagner and Wagner's wife Cosima. And that's interesting because music was very important for Nietzsche. He kind of got this from Schopenhauer. He read Schopenhauer while he was a student. Schopenhauer thought that music was the sound of real reality in the most unfiltered form. It's the closest we can get to experiencing reality directly, unfiltered by the synthesizing mind. Now, Nietzsche didn't think that, but he thought that music was deep in a way that other arts aren't. And so he was very excited by being invited into Richard Wagner's sort of intimate circle of friends, although this didn't last that long, and eventually Nietzsche broke with Wagner and transferred his allegiance from Wagner to Bizet. He ultimately felt that there was something more honest and in a way deeper about Bizet's opera Carmen, which was about ordinary people or human beings. It wasn't about gods and dwarves and Rhine maidens and the like. He thought that was in its own way deeper than Wagner's operas, which are certainly striving for depth. Nietzsche evidently came to the view that he didn't achieve it. So in 1872, Nietzsche published his first book, which was The Birth of Tragedy. And this is about how ancient Greek culture developed the practice of tragic theatre. Why would an entire community go and watch a very miserable play in which somebody dies and other people lament it and are unable to cope with the initial death and probably end up dying themselves? I mean, if you think Shakespeare's tragedies are a bit miserable, try the original Greek stuff, right? So why would a society invent that, when you could watch wrestling or listen to music or something, right? Well, Nietzsche had an answer. I'm not going to talk about that answer now, but what I want to pull out of it is the core of his answer is that ancient Greek culture was driven really by two impulses. one that he thought of as Apollonian. He associated with the god Apollo, which is kind of daylight, order, harmony. Apollo is the god of music, and music is about harmony and regular rhythm and kind of orderliness in sound and time. And the other god is Dionysius, which is the nighttime revel. So you lose yourself. It's about the Dionysian principle is about losing yourself in sort of all-night rave. So these are kind of two opposing principles. And according to Nietzsche's first book, they're at war, or they're in conflict through Greek culture. And Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, is as vibrant and as violent as it was, according to Nietzsche, because it wasn't just animated by one principle, it was animated by two. Now, this idea that you explain change and a kind of disturbed state, both in a culture and in an individual, by saying, well, there are two spirits animating this person or this culture, and they don't get on very well. That's an idea that we will meet in the bit of Nietzsche's philosophy that we will study. We're not going to talk much about Apollo and Dionysius, but we will talk about pagans and Christians. So one idea that's there in Nietzsche, well, Nietzsche picks it up from other people, as you will see when you read the little bit of Schopenhauer that I've set for you. The idea that there is a deep contrast between the pagan approach to life, particularly ancient Greek and Roman paganism on the one hand, and the Christian approach to life on the other. That's part of 19th century intellectual culture, and it's central to Nietzsche. It's central to Nietzsche's understanding of how we got to where we are today and why we're in such a mess. The other duality, which kind of overlays that one, is between masters and slaves, or master morality and slave morality. And again, just like we are the inheritors of both pagan and Christian culture, we're also the inheritors of masterly and slavish moralities. We'll talk about exactly what that means. All I want you to get hold of now is the thought that Nietzsche explains conflict and sort of confusion and the disturbed state of individual and collective minds and philosophical imagination by saying, well, this is all such a mess because there are two gods, there are two spirits animating or trying to direct the life of this person or this community, and they don't get on, and that's why it's all such a mess. So in 1879, Nietzsche fell ill. He fell out with everyone, particularly Wagner and Cosima Wagner, and he resigned his job. He was no longer able to do it because he was too ill. Now, it doesn't really matter exactly what disease he had. There was a lot of speculation about it. What matters is that it left him ill, and it meant that he couldn't write thick books, right? Because he didn't have the energy, and he suffered from blinding headaches. So he was only able to ever to write short books or short works, and that changed the way he did philosophy. It also meant that he had to travel. He left Northern Europe and travelled to Italy, looking for a better climate that would help his health. And this introduced him to Mediterranean cultures that he wouldn't previously have encountered or understood. And by the early 1880s, he was self-administering quite a lot of opium. So again, this changes how you might read his book. There's some very deep philosophy in his books, but there are also some passages where you do wonder what sort of condition he was in when he wrote them. And so the decade from 1879 to 1889 was when he wrote all his good stuff, and he turned out something every year in that decade, pretty much. So all the famous books, particularly the ones we're going to read, were published during that decade. And during that decade, He was stateless. He was not entirely friendless, but he was pretty isolated. He was itinerant most of the time. And eventually, at the end of that decade, he fell more seriously ill and suffered a kind of mental health breakdown. There's a kind of legend about that. And he spent the remaining 11 years of his life more or less incapacitated and eventually died in 1900. And in later years, he was cared for by his sister, who was sort of fervently right-wing and went through his works looking for evidence that or material that would make Nietzsche look like a kind of fervid German nationalist. And she published some stuff under the title The Will to Power after he died, which sort of made him look that way. Oh, and by the way, she also allowed his moustache to grow. So when he was doing his own grooming, Nietzsche kept his moustache fairly well trimmed. There are sort of early photographs of Nietzsche with a fairly sensible moustache. But she wanted to promote the idea of him as a sort of great sage, and so she allowed his moustache to grow. And so you'll see photographs of Nietzsche with this enormous, preposterously huge moustache. Those are mostly taken from towards the end of his life when she was looking after him and he wasn't really capable of managing his own affairs. Okay, so what I want you to do now, if you haven't done it already, is read that little extract of Schopenhauer where he talks about the decoration of coffins in pagan and Christian antiquity.